A Dutch millionaire bankrolled two strangers, then walked away forgiving £60,000 in debt. They built an empire, 60 million records sold. But a gentleman's handshake shattered into lawsuits and broken wrists. Former brothers turned to pack of wolves, suing for royalties to songs that came from one man's soul. And in September 2025, death closed any hope of peace. This is Supertramp, where the greatest harmonies couldn't survive the creative civil war that destroyed them. The story of Supertramp begins not in a garage or a dingy London pub, but in a Munich recording studio in 1969, where desperation met opportunity in the most unlikely way imaginable. Rick Davies was a working-class keyboardist whose previous band, The Joint, had just collapsed in Munich. He was broke, stranded, and running out of options. Then fate intervened in the form of Stanley August Miesegaze, a Dutch millionaire who saw something in Davies that nobody else could see. Miesegaze made Davies an offer that seemed too good to be true. He would fund a dream band if Davies could assemble the right musicians. This wasn't charity. This was a calculated investment in untapped potential. Davies placed an advertisement in Melody Maker on August 9, 1969, promising a genuine opportunity for good musicians. Among the responses was a young man named Roger Hodgson, a private school-educated multi-instrumentalist whose mother was, in Hodgson's own words, getting sick of having me at home and saw the ad as a solution. Before we continue, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. The contrast between these two men would define everything that followed. Davies brought a gritty, blues-informed sensibility rooted in the working-class British experience. Hodgson brought classical training, a 4-octave vocal range, and an introspective spirituality that would later manifest in some of rock's most thoughtful lyrics. When they met for the first time, Hodgson sang "Dear Mr. Fantasy" by Traffic. Davies was impressed enough to bring him into the fold. Together with various rotating members, they formed a band initially called Daddy, later renamed Supertramp, after the 1910 autobiography by W.H. Davies. The early years were marked by creative searching and commercial failure. Their self-titled debut album in 1970 went nowhere. Their second album, indelibly stamped in 1971, fared no better. Davies later described these early efforts as a collection of lengthy and uninteresting solos that failed to connect with audiences. By 1972, the dream was dying. Miesegaze had bankrolled the operation for 3 years, spending what would be over £150,000 in today's money. The albums weren't selling, the tours weren't profitable, the benefactor had finally had enough. But instead of demanding repayment, Miesegaze did something extraordinary. He forgave the entire debt and walked away, giving Davies and Hodgson a clean slate and one last chance to get it right. Two struggling musicians, abandoned by their benefactor, left with nothing but a name and a vision. The money was gone. The safety net was gone. All they had left was each other and the belief that they could create something that mattered. After Miesegaze departed, Davies and Hodgson rebuilt the band from the ground up. They recruited the classic lineup: bassist Dougie Thompson, drummer Bob Siebenberg, and woodwind player John Helliwell. This quintet represented the final, refined version of Supertramp, the lineup that would change everything. A&M Records, sensing untapped potential, sequestered the band in Southcombe Farmhouse in Somerset, England, to rehearse. The isolation was deliberate. They needed to find their sound away from the distractions of London, away from the pressures of the music industry. Then they brought in producer Ken Scott, a Beatles engineer who had just finished working with David Bowie on Ziggy Stardust. Scott's technical genius and his willingness to push boundaries made him the perfect architect for what would become Crime of the Century. But the process was brutal. Scott later admitted that when he first heard the demos, he thought they were utter crap and completely random. However, after seeing them perform live, he recognized that they just needed someone to channel their energy into something cohesive. The recording sessions were notoriously meticulous. Scott and the band would spend over a day and a half just trying to get the snare drum right. They used drum brushes shaking in front of microphones to create a wind effect. They recorded a musical saw on "Hide in Your Shell" to achieve an otherworldly sound. They even went to London Paddington Station to record an actual train for authenticity on the track, Rudy.
Dreamer.
album's concept explored themes of education, mental health, and social conformity, topics that resonated deeply with the disillusioned youth of the mid-1970s. The opening track, School, featured a girl's scream that represented the conformist pressures of the British school system. The transition from the loneliness of school to the righteous anger of bloody well right created a narrative arc that spoke to anyone who had ever felt trapped by society's expectations. Crime of the Century was released in 1974 and immediately established Supertramp as a force to be reckoned with. The album peaked at number 4 in the UK and number 38 in the US, their first appearance on the American charts. The lead single, Dreamer, written by Hodgson, became the hit that had eluded them for 5 years. The album's success wasn't just commercial, it was artistic validation. Crime of the Century remains, for many fans, the band's artistic peak, even if it wasn't their commercial zenith. It proved that Davies and Hodgson's vision, cerebral yet accessible, progressive yet melodic, could work. But success, as they would soon learn, comes with its own set of complications. By 1979, Supertramp had relocated to the west coast of the United States, specifically to the Village Recorder in Los Angeles. The move was strategic. They wanted to be closer to the American market that had embraced them. But the geographic shift also reflected a deeper philosophical divide that was quietly forming between Davies and Hodgson. The recording of Breakfast in America was described by John Helliwell as longer and more tedious than usual. Helliwell recalled a recurring studio disagreement. Hodgson would use an ionizer to improve air quality, which gave Helliwell headaches, leading to a constant cycle of turning it off and on. These tense silences were becoming more frequent. But despite the growing tensions, what emerged from those sessions was nothing short of a masterpiece.
Teach me how to be sensible, logical.
Breakfast in America was released in March 1979 and became a global phenomenon. The album sold over 15 million copies worldwide. It reached number 1 on the US Billboard 200 and stayed there for 6 weeks. It produced 4 massive hits: The Logical Song, Goodbye Stranger, Take the Long Way Home, and the title track. The band was nominated for 2 Grammy Awards. The album's title and cover art became points of contention. Rick Davies originally wanted to call the album Hello Stranger, but Hodgson convinced him to choose Breakfast in America because it was a fun title that suited the fun feeling of the album. This was the moment Supertramp became the soundtrack of America. You heard these songs everywhere, on the radio driving to work, at high school dances, blasting from car speakers on summer nights. The band played sold-out arenas from coast to coast. This was the peak. This was the dream realized. But the very success of the album masked a fundamental problem. The fun and pop-oriented songs that made Breakfast in America a commercial juggernaut were primarily Hodgson's compositions. Davies' blues-based rock was being pushed to the margins. The creative balance that had defined their partnership was tilting dangerously to one side. Hodgson later admitted, "I never really felt like a band. They always felt like a band, but I felt like a solo artist in a band." This sense of isolation, of being the odd man out even at the height of their success, was eating away at him. And Davies, for his part, was so convinced that Breakfast in America would never reach the top 5 that he had bet drummer Bob Siebenberg $100. He lost the bet, but the cynicism behind it revealed something darker. Davies didn't believe in the pop direction that was making them millions. The creative civil war was already underway. The audience just couldn't see it yet. By the early 1980s, the geographic and creative distance between Davies and Hodgson had become unbearable. Hodgson moved his family to Northern California to pursue a quieter, more spiritual life. The rest of the band remained in Los Angeles. The physical separation mirrored the emotional chasm that was widening between them. The recording of Famous Last Words in 1982 was described by Hodgson as a nightmare experience. The two leaders clashed constantly over the band's direction. Hodgson wanted to continue the pop success of Breakfast in America. Davies and the rhythm section wanted to return to longer, more progressive tracks. the kind of music that had defined crime of the century. The album's title was painfully prophetic. These would be the famous last words of the classic Davies-Hodgson partnership. Famous Last Words was released in October 1982. It reached number 5 in the US, a commercial success by any normal standard, but a drop from Breakfast in America. The album went gold, but it felt like a disappointment after the stratospheric heights they had achieved just 3 years earlier. After the 1983 World Tour, Roger Hodgson made his announcement. In a concert in Munich, between the songs Waiting So Long and Give a Little Bit, he told the stunned audience that he was leaving Supertramp. The split was finalized with what became known as the verbal agreement. It was a gentleman's handshake, witnessed by the other band members. The terms were simple. Rick Davies would keep the name Supertramp and continue touring with the band. Roger Hodgson would keep full ownership of his songs and could perform them as a solo artist. It seemed fair. It seemed honorable. It was supposed to be the civilized way to end a 14-year partnership. But verbal agreements, as Hodgson would learn decades later, are only as good as the people who make them. After the split, both men pursued their own paths with varying degrees of success. Roger Hodgson released In the Eye of the Storm in 1984, which sold 2 million copies. The album was seen by many fans as the true musical sequel to Breakfast in America. Hodgson's solo work embodied the melodic, spiritual pop that had made Supertramp famous. He toured extensively, connecting with audiences who had followed him since the early days. Then tragedy struck. In 1987, Hodgson broke both wrists in an accident, halting his touring career for years. The injury couldn't have come at a worse time. Just as he was establishing himself as a solo artist, his ability to play guitar and keyboard was suddenly compromised. Meanwhile, Rick Davies took sole command of Supertramp. He released Brother Where You Bound in 1985, a progressive and jazz-inflected album featuring a 16-minute title track. The album included a guitar solo by Pink Floyd's David Gilmour, a favor that was later returned when John Helliwell played on Pink Floyd's A Momentary Lapse of Reason. The album reached number 21 in the US and went gold. But as the years passed, Davies' version of Supertramp saw declining sales in smaller venues. The magic of the Hodgson era was gone. The hits that audiences wanted to hear, The Logical Song, Dreamer, Take the Long Way Home, were Hodgson's songs, and Davies didn't have the right to perform them, or at least he wasn't supposed to. By the 2000s, the tension escalated. Davies began touring as Supertramp and playing Hodgson's hits without permission. The verbal agreement, the gentleman's handshake, had been broken. Hodgson was furious. He felt betrayed not just professionally, but personally. These were songs that came from his soul, and Davies was using them to sell tickets to fans who believed they were seeing the original band. The bitterness turned legal. In 2024, John Helliwell, Bob Siebenberg, and Dougie Thompson, the rhythm section, sued Hodgson over a 1977 royalty-sharing agreement. The agreement had given the non-songwriters a cut of the publishing royalties, but Hodgson argued it was only meant to be temporary because the other 3 members were broke at the time. Hodgson's lawyer described the lawsuit as a pack of wolves coming after my client for a piece of the songwriting royalties, for the songs that he wrote that came from his soul. In 2025, an appeals court ruled against Hodgson, reinstating the payments for the life of the copyrights. It was a devastating blow, not just financially, but emotionally. The men he had considered brothers had turned on him in his moment of vulnerability. The creative civil war had become an actual war. On September 6, 2025, Rick Davies passed away at the age of 81 after a decade-long battle with multiple myeloma, a form of blood cancer. His death closed the final chapter on any possibility of a reunion between the 2 voices that had defined Supertramp. The band's official tribute noted that Rick's music and legacy continue to inspire many and bears testament to the fact that great songs never die, they live on. In his final years, Davies had enjoyed performing with his hometown buds as Ricky and the Rockets, a move that reflected his warm personality and resilience despite the illness that was slowly consuming him. Roger Hodgson continues to tour as a solo artist, performing the hits that made Supertramp legendary. He plays The Logical Song, Dreamer, and Take the Long Way Home to audiences who have followed him for over 4 decades. The fans know these songs by heart. They sing along, they remember.
Well, take the long way home. Take the long way.
But for Hodgson, there's always an undercurrent of sadness. He once reflected on the partnership with Davies, saying, "I could be putting down his way of thinking, and he could be challenging my way of seeing life." The contrast is what makes Supertramp go round. Davies had countered with a more somber analogy. It's like two people who are painting a picture on the same canvas, and you have problems because the picture doesn't get finished. The picture was never finished. The partnership that created 60 million records sold ended in lawsuits, broken promises, and decades of bitterness. The gentleman's handshake became a symbol of betrayal. The creative civil war destroyed what could have been one of rock's great enduring partnerships. But here's the truth that outlasts all the conflict. The music survived. Breakfast in America and Crime of the Century remain in heavy rotation on classic rock radio and streaming platforms. The Logical Song continues to speak to anyone who has ever felt disillusioned by the world. Dreamer still captures that hopeful spirit of youth. And the hi-fi quality of Crime of the Century is so perfect that it's still used today, 50 years later, to demonstrate the capabilities of high-end audio equipment. Supertramp's music is more than just nostalgia. The legacy of Supertramp is one of triumph and tragedy, brotherhood and betrayal. They proved that accessible progressive rock could conquer the world. They showed that two voices, one working class, one private school, could create something that transcended their differences. But they also proved that even 60 million records sold couldn't stop personal conflict. That even a gentleman's handshake could be broken. That success and happiness aren't the same thing. The creative civil war tore them apart, but the music, those timeless, unforgettable melodies, continues to bring us together. Supertramp's story reminds us that the greatest harmonies often emerge from the deepest discord. 60 million records sold, 2 Grammy Awards, stadiums filled with fans singing every word. But the cost was a partnership destroyed by the very success it created. Rick Davies is gone now, taking with him any hope of reconciliation. Yet, the music endures, still taking the long way home for millions who never forgot. Which Supertramp song still takes you back? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories from rock's golden era.